Jonathan Crane sat cocooned in the quiet hum of his black luxury sedan, a gleaming machine polished to the perfection he demanded from everything in his orbit. The tinted windows filtered the chaos of the city into something distant, muted, unimportant. It was a world he had long ago trained himself to rise above. The sedan wasn't simply a car, it was a moving fortress, a throne of leather and glass where he ruled with the swipe of a finger and the cool precision of his voice. He leaned back, one leg crossed elegantly over the other, the faint scent of expensive cologne clinging to his flawless light blue suit. His phone screen glowed in his hand, its flood of messages and updates an endless battlefield of numbers and deadlines. He thrived here, in the heat of confrontation, where weakness was currency and control was his weapon. The man on the other end of the call was stammering excuses, each word a grating note in Jonathan's ear. The shipment was delayed, Mr. Crane. There were unforeseen problems with Jonathan's lips curled in a smile that contained no warmth. Unforeseen to you, perhaps. To me, this is negligence, and negligence has a cost. His voice was calm, even soothing, but beneath the tone lurked a blade sharpened on years of dominance. He did not shout. He did not need to. Those who worked under him knew what silence meant, what those measured pauses threatened. As he spoke, his eyes flicked to the skeletal framework of the construction site just across the narrow street. Steel columns rose like ribs of a giant creature, incomplete, trembling in the autumn breeze. Cranes creaked overhead, their cables taut under immense weight, swinging beams across the skyline like pendulums marking time. Workers in orange vests scurried below, ants to him, anonymous hands building yet another monument to his empire. The cables groaned faintly, strained metal against sky. Dust swirled in the air, carrying the tang of rust and fresh-cut steel. A beam shifted, only slightly, enough that its unnatural sway should have caught the eye of anyone paying attention. Jonathan didn't notice. His gaze passed over it with indifference, dismissing it as background noise to his more important concerns. Inside the car, insulated from the grit and noise, he was untouchable. Every inch of his world was polished, controlled, predictable. His empire was built on eliminating uncertainty, crushing chaos into order. He viewed people as columns on a balance sheet, assets that delivered profit, liabilities that bled resources. The man on the phone had already slid into the wrong category. "I'll expect a written proposal by the end of the day," Jonathan said, his tone as precise as a scalpel. "And if it doesn't meet my standards, I'll make sure you're replaced by someone who can meet them." Deadlines don't bend for incompetence. The call ended with a sharp chime, and silence reclaimed the car. Jonathan set the phone down on the leather seat beside him, his reflection staring back from the polished screen. His dark hair was perfectly in place, every strand obeying, every line of his face chiseled into the mask of authority. His piercing blue eyes carried no hint of doubt. Beyond the glass, a gust of wind rocked the cables again. One strained, fibers splitting, threads of metal whispering a warning. The sound was faint, swallowed by the city's constant grind of horns and engines and drills. Jonathan tapped his finger against the steering wheel, already drafting his next move, already tightening the leash on a dozen more subordinates. He existed in a rhythm of conquest, blind to the small, fragile signs of disorder gathering at the edges of his kingdom. In his throne of steel and leather, Jonathan Crane believed he was untouchable. Outside, the city shifted, strained, and whispered of cracks in the order he prized above all else. The hum of chaos brushed against his walls, unnoticed. Waiting. Jonathan was still savoring the silence after the call when the knock came. Sharp, unexpected, out of place. He froze for a fraction of a second, annoyed that the rhythm of his world had been interrupted. Another knock, harder this time, followed by a muffled voice that barely penetrated the sealed interior. Jonathan's jaw tightened. He turned his head, eyes narrowing, expecting perhaps a beggar, a parking attendant with poor judgment, or one of those reckless city hawkers who thought selling trinkets through tinted glass was a clever idea. What he saw instead was so wrong it made him pause. Two girls stood side by side, framed against the jagged backdrop of scaffolding and steel. They were impossibly alike, identical in every way, from the neat braids that hung over their shoulders to the flutter of their simple white dresses. In the gritty breeze, they couldn't have been more than 6, maybe 7 at most, but their faces were masks of urgency, their small fists pounding on his window with unrelenting desperation. Jonathan's first instinct was irritation. This city bred strangeness, but this was beyond the usual noise. He lowered the window just enough to let his voice slip out. low and cutting. "What do you want? Do you realize how foolish this is?" The girls didn't flinch. They leaned in, eyes wide, voices overlapping, thin but shrill with panic. "You have to get out. Right now, please." Jonathan blinked. He glanced up and down the street, searching for cameras, a laughing parent, some explanation for this intrusion. There was nothing. The workers across the street carried on with their tasks, shouting at one another over the roar of machinery. Traffic slid by with its endless stream of engines and horns. But here, at his car, Tom seemed to hesitate. His irritation swelled, fed by disbelief. "Is this a game?" he asked, his tone dripping with dismissal. "Do you know who I am? Do you know what it means to waste my time?" Still, they didn't move. One girl tugged at the door handle, frantic, while the other slammed her palms flat against the glass. Their eyes were not mischievous, not playful, but wide with something Jonathan recognized only dimly fear, raw and uncalculated. For the first time, a sliver of unease wormed its way beneath his armor. Children didn't act like this, not unless something was very wrong. He sighed, muttered to himself about absurdity, and unlocked the door with a sharp press of his thumb. The moment it clicked, the girls yanked it open, reaching for him with tiny hands that gripped far stronger than he expected. "Come on," one cried, her voice breaking. "It's not safe. You have to move." Jonathan resisted, confused and angry, but the urgency in their grip was relentless, almost magnetic, against his own instincts, against the icy logic that usually defined him. He allowed himself to be pulled a few steps from the car, then the world tore open. A metallic snap ripped through the air, violent, final. The sound wasn't just heard, it was felt, a vibration that seemed to split the earth beneath his feet. Jonathan turned, eyes widening as the massive steel cable above whipped loose. Recoiling like a serpent in the sky, the beam it had carried, thousands of pounds of iron, plunged downward and hit his car with a thunderous crash that shook the street. The black sedan buckled in an instant, flattened into a grotesque sculpture of twisted steel and shattered glass. The sound reverberated through the construction site, sending dust and debris into a choking cloud that rolled over the pavement. Jonathan staggered back, staring at the ruin. He saw his own death in that wreckage, a perfect reflection of himself reduced to mangled metal. Seconds earlier, he had been inside, calculating his empire's next conquest. Now, he was outside, alive only because the small strangers had dragged him into the chaos of the street. Around them, workers shouted and ran, pointing, scrambling toward the disaster. But Jonathan barely heard. His focus was locked on the two little girls clutching his hands, their tiny bodies trembling, their eyes wide not with triumph, but with terror for him. He couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't reconcile the impossible collision of power and fragility that now defined his existence. His world of control had shattered with a beam, and all that held him steady in that moment were the trembling fingers of two children who should not have been there at all. The sound that split the air was like nothing Jonathan Crane had ever heard before. A metallic shriek, high and violent, slicing through the hum of the city with surgical precision. It was not the noise of progress, not the ordinary groan of machinery. This was the sound of something giving way, of a colossal weight breaking free from the order that bound it. Jonathan turned in time to see the cable snap, a whip of steel thrashing against the sky, sparks glittering as it struck scaffolding on its way down. For one impossible heartbeat, the beam it carried hung in the air, suspended like a sword raised above a condemned man's neck. Then gravity claimed it. The world convulsed. The steel slammed into his car with a violence that seemed to shake the foundations of the city. Glass exploded outward in glittering shards. Metal folded inward, collapsing like it crushed beneath an unseen hand. Tires burst, rubber shrieking. The hood buckled, the roof caved, and the gleaming machine that had been Jonathan's sanctuary, the mobile throne, from which he commanded his empire, was reduced to a mangled coffin of twisted black steel. Dust erupted in a choking wave, engulfing the street in a storm of grit and ash. The air tasted of rust and burning oil. Jonathan stumbled back, the small hands of the girls anchoring him to reality as the sound echoed an aftershock of violence that rattled in his bones. He could not look away. His mind, so precise, so disciplined, scrambled to process what had just happened. Moments ago, he had been inside that car, his body relaxed against leather seats, his voice cutting down a trembling subordinate. Now, that same space was unrecognizable, obliterated, a tomb for the man he would have been had he not stepped out, Shouts pierced the haze. Construction workers sprinted toward the wreckage, their boots pounded against pavement. Their voice is sharp with panic. Orders were barked, curses shouted, alarms wailed from the site. Somewhere, sirens began their distant cry, wailing like a dirge racing toward the scene. But Jonathan heard none of it clearly. His ears rang with the echo of destruction, drowning out everything but the hammering of his own heartbeat. The twins were still beside him, clutching his hand so tightly his fingers ached. Their small faces were streaked with dust, their braids tangled by the wind, but their eyes were fixed not on the wreckage, but on him. Wide, unblinking, trembling with fear not for themselves, but for him. And that unsettled him more than the crash. He had built his empire on the certainty that people feared him. Fear was the lever he pulled to bend the world. But here, in this moment, it was reversed. These two fragile creatures, powerless by every measure he understood, had been afraid for him and had acted when he would not. Jonathan's throat tightened. He wanted to speak, to demand answers, to reclaim control with the cutting authority of his voice. But the words died before they left his lips. All he could do was stare at the wreckage, his mind conjuring images of his own body crushed within it, his skull split beneath the weight, his name reduced to a tragic headline. The illusion of control was gone. For the first time in years, Jonathan Crane felt the cold touch of humility, creeping like frost through the cracks in his armor. His empire, his wealth, his precision, all of it had been useless against the randomness of a frayed cable. $1 billion could not buy a second chance. Only to little strangers had given him that. The dust began to settle, drifting in heavy clouds through the ruined street. Jonathan stood in the midst of it all, disoriented, stripped bare. Around him, the city hummed with chaos, but inside his chest there was only silence, a cavernous emptiness that no deal, no fortune, no empire could fill. He tightened his grip on the girl's hands, not out of authority, but out of need, and that terrified him most of all. Jonathan Crane sat at the edge of the street, dust still clinging to his flawless suit like the fingerprints of chaos itself. Around him, men in neon vests swarmed the wreckage of his car, shouting orders, calling for medics, snapping photographs. A foreman cursed into his radio, sweat streaking through the grit on his forehead. The crowd gathered, cell phones raised. Strangers whispering about how the city's most untouchable man had almost been split in two by falling steel. Jonathan barely registered them. His gaze was fixed on the two little girls. They stood close, one on either side, their small hands still clasping his as if they feared he might vanish if they let go. But as the chaos rose around them, Jonathan noticed something strange. None of the workers rushing past seemed to glance at them. No one shouted for the children to move away. No panicked parent came running through the smoke, desperate to reclaim them. It was as if only he could see them. He blinked hard, the grit burning his eyes, but when his vision cleared they were still there, two tiny figures in white dresses, now dull gray by dust. Their faces were calm, unnervingly calm, as though they had seen this 1,000 times before. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they released his hands. Jonathan staggered, an emptiness rushing into his palms where their small fingers had been. The twins stepped back in unison, eyes locked on him, unreadable, ancient in their stillness. Before he could demand answers, before he could even form the words, they turned, and in the blink of an eye, they were gone, swallowed by the smoke and the crowd, vanishing as though the city itself had claimed them. He lurched to his feet, scanning the street, searching desperately for the flutter of white dresses in the haze. Nothing. Workers rushed. Sirens wailed closer, but no one spoke of children. No one mentioned the two small saviors who had pulled him from death's grasp. Jonathan's chest tightened, his throat dry. For the first time in years, he felt utterly powerless. Later, in the back of a replacement car sent by his assistant, Jonathan sat in silence as the driver wove through traffic. The leather interior gleamed, identical to the one destroyed, but now it felt like a coffin with the lid closed. His reflection in the window was pale, haunted, his piercing blue eyes rimmed with red. He barely recognized himself. He replayed it over and over, the pounding on the glass, the urgent voices, the grip of tiny hands, the metallic snap, the crushing impact. Every detail returned with punishing clarity, but each time, the same question echoed louder. How had they known? The city outside blurred, neon lights smearing across the glass like streaks of blood. Jonathan pressed his palms together, fingers trembling in a way they never had during hostile negotiations or boardroom ambushes. Fear was unfamiliar, unwelcome, and it was burrowing deep. When he finally arrived at his penthouse, he found no refuge. The sweeping views of the city, once symbols of his dominance, now looked fragile. The lights of the skyline flickered like dying stars, and every shadow seemed to conceal the small silhouettes waiting just beyond his vision. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, hand unsteady enough to spill amber liquid across the marble counter. He drank deeply, but the burn did nothing to cauterize the unease. His empire had been built on facts, numbers, contracts, iron and glass. Yet today, his life had been spared by something that defied all calculation. The twins. He whispered the word to himself like a confession. Had they been real? His staff had no record of them, no witnesses had spoken of them, and the workers swore no children had been anywhere near the site. But Jonathan remembered the strength of their hands, the raw urgency in their voices. He could still feel the echo of their touch, and as he stared at his own trembling reflection in the glass walls of his tower, he realized the truth he feared most. He was no longer in control. Something else had entered his world, something small, fragile, and unstoppable. The cracks in Jonathan Crane's armor had begun to spread. The city had always obeyed Jonathan Crane's gaze. Glass towers rose at his command, streets bent to his projects, and people ducked under the weight of his authority. But in the nights that followed the collapse, the city began to turn against him. It started with whispers, not from people he was used to those, but from his own mind, replaying the moment the cable snapped. That metallic scream lived in his ears, echoing in boardrooms and penthouses, louder than the voices of men begging for extensions or investors, praising his ruthlessness. Then came the visions. Jonathan was riding the elevator to his top-floor suite when he caught the faintest reflection in the mirrored wall. Two small figures in white dresses standing behind him. His pulse jumped. He spun, fists clenched. The space was empty. The mirrored walls showed only himself, composed as ever, except for the tremor in his hand. At first, he dismissed it as fatigue, stress, the mind's rebellion after shock. But the sightings multiplied. On a rain-slick street, a pair of braids flashed in the crowd. In the boardroom, while a junior executive stumbled through a presentation, Jonathan saw two pairs of eyes staring at him from the glass behind the man's head. Once, waking in the blue hush before dawn, he swore he felt the weight of small fingers pressing against his palm, pulling him upward out of sleep. He could not escape them. The twins were everywhere, yet nowhere. Always just at the edge of vision, vanishing when he turned too quickly, appearing in reflections that should have shown only him. They weren't mocking. They weren't playful. They were watching. Always watching. Jonathan, a man who prided himself on precision and logic, found his thoughts fracturing. Meetings blurred. His assistant repeated questions twice, 3 times, before his mind caught up. His empire thrived on order, but his signature appeared sloppy on contracts. At night, he poured drink after drink, whiskey spilling across marble as if his own hand no longer trusted him. And through it all, he wondered, why me? Why had they appeared that day? Why had they saved him? Children should have run, screamed, hidden. Instead, they had acted with purpose, urgency beyond their years. How had they known the beam would fall? He demanded answers, but the city offered none. No orphanage, no school, no parent searching for lost daughters. As if the twins belonged only to him, born from the steel and dust of that street. One night, he walked the construction site alone. The wreckage of his car had long since been cleared, but the stain of oil still blackened the concrete. The new framework rose higher now, beams bolted tight, cables stretched taut. Workers had called it a miracle no one had died that day. Jonathan stood in the silence, his footsteps echoing on hollow metal, and felt the city itself holding its breath. Then he saw them, high above, on a catwalk where no child could possibly stand. The twins appeared, dresses pale against the night, hair catching the moonlight, their eyes locked on him. He froze, throat tight. Neither moved, neither spoke, and then, without a sound, they were gone, swallowed by shadow. Jonathan staggered back, a shiver cutting through his spine. He had faced billion-dollar negotiations without blinking, destroyed competitors without hesitation. Yet 2 children to impossibilities had unraveled him in ways no rival could. The empire he had built on control was trembling, not from hostile takeovers or market crashes, but from something far smaller, far more terrifying. Innocence had become his haunting, and it would not let him go. Jonathan Crane had spent weeks trying to smother the ghost with logic. He threw himself into meetings, buried himself in contracts, even ordered his staff to double their schedules if his mind was busy enough. Perhaps it would silence the visions. But the harder he worked, the louder the city whispered back to him. The twins followed, always. They hovered at the edges of mirrors, drifted across crowded sidewalks, appeared for a heartbeat in the glass of conference tables. He told himself they weren't real, yet his hands still remembered the grip of their tiny fingers, pulling him from death. And then came the day of the gala. It was a fundraiser in the atrium of one of his newest towers, a monument of steel and glass that pierced the skyline like a blade. Journalists, investors, and politicians filled the hall, their laughter and the clink of crystal echoing beneath chandeliers that seemed to float like constellations. Jonathan arrived late, his presence drawing the hush of admiration that always followed him. In his midnight black suit, he looked untouchable again, as though the steel beam had been nothing more than rumor. But inside, he was listening for whispers, for footsteps to light to belong to men. The speeches began. A senator praising Crane's empire as the very engine of the city's rebirth. Jonathan nodded politely, scanning the crowd. That was when he saw them, to white dresses, motionless in the blur of suits and gowns. The twins stood near the far wall, half hidden behind a column, their eyes locked on him, unblinking, unshaken. Jonathan's chest tightened. No one else noticed. The crowd milled past them, without pause, as though the children weren't there at all. And then they raised their hands, both of them pointing at him. Jonathan felt the blood drain from his face. He turned his head, following the invisible line of their fingers. High above, glass panes gleamed in the rafters. The atrium ceiling, modern, delicate, suspended by cables, caught the light like 1,000 knives. A cable twitched. The sound was faint, a single note in the music of conversation. But Jonathan's heart seized. He shoved past a cluster of startled guests, his shoes slipping on polished marble. People gasped, startled at the sight of the city's most composed man moving with such desperation. The twins' voices cut through the noise, high and thin, but urgent as a siren. Move. Jonathan leapt sideways just as the cable gave way. The pane crashed down where he had been standing, exploding into a storm of glass. Shards slashed across the floor, cutting deep grooves into marble, slicing gowns, sending guests screaming and scattering. The chandelier swayed violently, sparks raining from a torn light fixture. The atrium transformed from elegance to chaos in the blink of an eye. Jonathan lay sprawled on the floor, breath ragged, his palms stinging from the glass. Above him, glittering fragments rained like icy rain. He looked up. The twins were gone. Panic surged through the crowd, blood on polished shoes, women shrieking, security shouting into radios. But Jonathan heard none of it. His ears roared with the memory of their voices. That single word, move. They had saved him again. As he struggled to his feet, eyes wide, trembling in a way no one had ever seen, a terrible clarity gripped him. This was no hallucination, no frayed edge of his sanity. Someone or something was intervening. Not once, but twice, and both times the saviors were children. But why? Why him? Why now? He stood amid the broken glass, the weight of every eye on him. His empire watching as its unshakable king faltered in plain sight. His hand trembled as he brushed glass from his suit. Somewhere in the crowd, cameras flashed, catching not the mask of power he had perfected, but a man pale, shaken, nearly broken, for the first time in his life. Jonathan Crane had no script, no calculation, no control. He only had questions. And at the center of them, the little girls who appeared from nowhere, who vanished without explanation, who saw danger before anyone else and who had spared him, twice, from certain death. The test was undeniable. Jonathan Crane had been chosen, or cursed. Jonathan Crane no longer slept. When he closed his eyes, he heard the metallic scream of snapping cables, the thunder of steel, the crash of shattering glass. When he opened them, he saw the twins silent, waiting, their eyes dark mirrors of something he could not name. He stopped attending board meetings. His empire ran on momentum, numbers climbing while the man who had built it withdrew into shadows. Rumors spread. Crane had grown sick, paranoid, broken. His rivals circled like sharks in bloodied water. Yet Jonathan hardly noticed. The twins had consumed him. He needed to know what they were. And so he searched. He hired investigators, sifted through city records, questioned workers, scanned footage from security cameras. Nothing, not a single frame captured them. Not a single report mentioned children near the construction site or at the gala. No missing persons bulletins matched their faces. It was as though they existed only for him. One rain-heavy evening, driven by an instinct he could not explain, Jonathan returned to the construction site where it had all begun. The tower loomed higher now, wrapped in scaffolding, its skeleton veiled by tarps that whipped and snapped in the storm. Lightning flared across the sky, illuminating the steel like the bones of some monstrous god. And there, standing by the gate, were the twins. Jonathan's heart jolted. They looked exactly as they had before, pale dresses clinging damp to their frames, braids plastered against their shoulders, eyes fixed unblinking on him. No umbrellas, no coats, no sign of shivering in the chill. Why? Jonathan's voice cracked, a foreign sound from a man who once ruled boardrooms with ice. He stepped toward them, rain soaking his suit, his hair disheveled, his composure gone. Why me? What do you want from me? The girls said nothing. They turned, slipping soundlessly through the gate into the half-finished tower. Jonathan followed. Inside, the storms were faded, replaced by the hollow drip of rain through scaffolding. His footsteps echoed on concrete floors. Shadows stretched across the unfinished corridors, twisting around him like claws. The girls walked ahead without sound, their white dresses glowing faintly in the dim. At last they stopped before a door. Rusted, half-hung, it creaked as they pushed it open. Jonathan stepped inside and froze. It was not an office, not storage. It was a shrine. Astra's children's shoes lined the wall in careful rows, scuffed and broken. Tiny toys, trucks, dolls, marbles sat on a cracked shelf. Faded photographs of smiling faces were pinned haphazardly, their corners curling with damp. Candles melted into puddles of wax on the floor. And in the center, a plaque mounted on stone, in memory of the third of 7 workers lost in the crane development collapse 12 years ago. Among them, 2 sisters, aged 6. Jonathan staggered, his breath shuddering out of him. His eyes darted to the photographs. There, in grainy color, were the twins, their smiles bright, their dresses white, the same braids, the same eyes. Dead, 12 years dead. His knees buckled. He clutched the wall, the weight of it crashing into him heavier than the beam ever had. It had been one of his first projects, a tower rushed to completion, corners cut to save costs. He remembered the lawsuits, the settlements, the way he dismissed the accident as an unfortunate price of progress. 37 dead, 2 children among them. He had signed papers, silenced voices, and moved on. And now they had returned. He turned to face them. They stood together in the doorway, rain dripping from their hair, their eyes black pools reflecting lightning. For the first time, Jonathan understood their silence. They had not come to thank him. They had not come to haunt him out of malice. They had come to show him what he had buried. Asterisk why me? He whispered again, though he already knew, because guilt never dies, because debts are never erased, because power cannot shield a man from the lives he has destroyed. The twins tilted their heads, moving in eerie unison, and then they stepped back into shadow, fading until only darkness remained. Jonathan was alone in the shrine, surrounded by toys, photographs, and ghosts. Outside, the storm broke in a peal of thunder that rattled the steel frame of the tower, echoing through the hollow chambers of his empire. For the first time in his life, Jonathan Crane, the man who had ruled with deadlines and control, fell to his knees. His fortune, his towers, his name, none of it mattered. All that remained were the eyes of 2 little girls, watching him from the other side of death. And as lightning split the sky above, Jonathan understood the final, shattering truth. He had not been saved. He had been sentenced. Asterisk.